Doctors see something coming out of baby's mouth. When they find out what it was, it left them in awe. A mother of a handsome and healthy 10-month-old baby noticed something very strange when she was changing his diaper one morning: a large red hole at the top of his mouth. Harvey had never shown signs of having this problem before, and you won't believe what this actually was and the surprise it gave the nurses at the hospital. This happened to Becky Stiles about 6 or so years ago. Becky Stiles was a 24-year-old mother who was an Essex native, who was born and raised in the county. Essex is described as a fast-paced place to live but suits both families and professionals. Becky was a mother of 3 boys and had recently gotten married after being with her boyfriend Stephen for 6 years. The two had met through mutual friends and always knew they wanted to be together for the rest of their lives. The boys' names were Tom, James, and Harvey. Tom and James were twins and had been the couple's first children. Harvey was their 3rd child and the baby of the bunch, being exactly 5 years younger than his older brothers. The married couple and their sons lived in a charming house in a gated community. Becky's husband owned a construction business and she'd originally had her own clothing boutique, but after Harvey was born, Becky made the move to being a full-time mom. Tom and James were a definite handful, and at 5.5 years old, they were enough to get up to mischief all the time. But they were also 2 very caring boys. Tom and James made friends easily and loved sports just like their dad did. Harvey in general was a dream. He'd been a bit sick when he was born and he'd gotten some fluid into his lungs, but after a short stay in the neonatal unit, he was allowed home. The 3 certainly kept Becky busy, as she wouldn't have acted any other way. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, Becky had seen what she believed to be a hole at the top of her 10-month-old Harvey's mouth. While she'd been changing him one morning, Harvey had opened his mouth to yawn, and that's when this red circular shape caught Becky's eye. She immediately panicked. What on earth was that? Harvey had a hole in his mouth that she'd never noticed before. Feelings of guilt started rushing over her and she yelled for her husband to come over and see what was going on with their son. Becky's husband came to see what all the fuss was about, and after Becky told him what she thought she'd seen, he ran to go fetch a flashlight. Becky had already tried to look and feel into Harvey's mouth a second time, but he just screamed at her. The first thought that came to Becky's mind was that he was in pain and that's why he was protesting like that. When her husband shone inside Harvey's mouth, he too noticed a red spot inside on his palate. When Becky had first told him that Harvey had a hole in his mouth, he hadn't believed her, but now looking at this, it definitely seemed like Harvey did in fact have a hole at the top of his mouth. Becky hadn't seen wrong or so. They both thought it was bizarre, and he too questioned how he could have missed the hole. Becky would later recount this whole story to a local newspaper in a column for Stories of the Year. Harvey and Becky and her husband both decided it would be best to rush him to the emergency room. They didn't know what could have caused such an injury to their son, but they were seriously concerned about the health effects it would have on him. They couldn't leave their other children alone, and bringing them with them would have added stress, so the couple bundled their children into the car and dropped the 2 older boys off at their grandparents' house. While they were there, Becky explained what was happening, and the grandparents were very concerned for their youngest grandson. "Let us know any news as soon as you have any," they told Becky. Grandpa and Grandma loved having Tom and James over. The boys were certainly rambunctious and full of energy, but they had converted a special toy room for them that kept them busy for hours. While they enjoyed spending time with the boys, they anxiously waited for news from Becky about what was going on with little Harvey. The closest emergency room was a long 30-minute drive away. Becky later recalled that the drive honestly felt like 2 hours long, and every worst-case scenario was running through her head in those 30 long minutes. Finally they got there, and upon hearing what the parents were saying, one of the nurses went straight to call a specialist to come and assist in the case. A hole in the mouth was of course very serious, and it would have been a cleft palate which would require surgery. The head nurse decided to take a closer look. She could see that the parents absolutely doted on Harvey, and missing something like a cleft palate would be incredibly unlikely. Firstly, that would have been picked up at birth when the baby tried to drink, and secondly, any trauma that caused a hole in the mouth would have been noticed immediately. No one goes days without noticing something like that. That happens, and certainly not a mother who's freaking out so much. The nurse then pulled out her own flashlight and the parents watched on as she spent a good 25 seconds gazing into Harvey's mouth. She then looked straight up and said, "I've got good news for you. Harvey doesn't have a hole in his mouth. That's a sticker stuck to the roof of his mouth." The staff in the room then looked over and had a chuckle. Becky didn't believe that at first and was determined to have a specialist check out her son's mouth, but the nurse assured her and she could easily convince her. She did that by popping her finger into Harvey's mouth and scraping out the sticker. She then handed the wet red round sticker to Becky and said, "Just in case you want to make a scrapbook about your first emergency room visit." At first, a huge wave of relief washed over Becky. Her son didn't have a hole in the top of his mouth. Thank goodness she wasn't a bad mother and she hadn't neglected to see this massive hole in his mouth from when it had first happened. But then a second wave washed over her, and that was one of pure embarrassment. She even told the newspaper that she, quote, "felt like a complete idiot." The staff was of course not mad at all about Becky bringing her son in. They'd rather have someone be safe than sorry. But they couldn't help a giggle looking at the sticker. Becky and her husband then scooped Harvey up and whisked him back into the car, but they first apologized and thanked the staff profusely. Both of them were told that they should never apologize for worrying about their son and that they were being good, caring parents. Tom and James were very protective over Harvey, so they would have been worried about him being sick. Becky then needed to call her family members and tell them that Harvey didn't have a hole in his mouth and that it had been a sticker all along. They too found the story to be very amusing. Becky and Stephen racked their brains for years afterwards trying to figure out where on earth Harvey got that sticker from. It didn't seem to be from one of his toys. He mostly preferred stuffed animals anyway, and they searched his room high and low for a match, but they couldn't find one.